Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Craig Kafura. I am Director for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy in the Lester Crown Center for U.S. Foreign Policy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The Council aims to foster a deeper understanding of global affairs here in Chicago, and tonight we're discussing the relationship between the United States, the Republic of China, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China, which we're just going to call China to keep things a little bit simpler. In my view, this is the most important, maybe the most consequential trilateral relationship in the world. And I'm honored to have Rorry Daniels, Damien Ma, and Kharis Templeman here with us tonight to help us better understand the many issues of this relationship. Rorry Daniels, far on our stage here, is the Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, leading strategy and operations for projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. She is also a Senior Fellow with ASPI's Center for China Analysis, and she regularly contributes to major media outlets on U.S. Asia-Pacific security matters. Previously, she managed Track 2 diplomacy and research on Asia security issues at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Damien Ma is adjunct faculty at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management and is the founder of Macropolo, a think tank here in Chicago focused on China. Previously, he served as senior analyst at Eurasia Group, focusing on Chinese and East Asian markets and U.S.-China relations. He also worked as a publications manager at the U.S.-China Business Council and taught at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Kharis Templeman is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region, and also a lecturer at the Center for East Asian Studies at Stanford University. Previously, he was a social science research scholar in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, where he managed the Taiwan Democracy and Security Project. We will start off today's program with a discussion, after which we will have time for Q&A with the audience. Please hold your questions until the Q&A portion. I know you have lots of them. For those joining virtually, you can submit your questions online at ccga.live. If you're in the room, you can also submit your questions online, or you can queue up at the mic stand, which will be placed in the center aisle. Before we begin, I do want to remind everyone that today's program is on the record and that views expressed by the speakers here are their own and do not reflect any institutional positions of the Council. With that, let's get started, because we have lots to cover, and only 45 minutes. So, just to frame things up, Kharis, I introduced these three countries by several different names. Can you give us a very, very short history of how we got to this situation where we have two different countries, People's Republic of China, Taiwan? How did we get here?
Yeah. To cut a long story short, it's the result of the Chinese Civil War that broke out in the 1940s between the nationalists and the communists on mainland China. And the nationalists lost the Civil War. They were running the Republic of China. They fled to Taiwan, bringing the regime with them. And the People's Republic of China was founded in their stead in Beijing. And so ever since the end of 1949, we've had these two regimes competing with one another across the Taiwan Strait.
And Roy, is that how Beijing sees this history more or less?
I mean, I think those are the bare bones of the history. I think from Beijing's perspective, it built a lot of its own political legitimacy on defeating the nationalist government, which at the time that the Civil War happened was not the same type of government that you see in Taiwan today. So for the years between 1949 and current and leading into the future, one of China's core priorities is returning Taiwan to the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China and Beijing. So I think that they agree on the basic facts, but also have this larger goal of wanting to politically unify, and are quite concerned that if Taiwan were to gain independence and it's the sovereignty over its territory were recognized by the international community, that would create a political crisis inside China, because its government has told its people for so long that it must sacrifice in order to achieve this goal of bringing the two sides back together under Beijing.
That's true. The United States and Taiwan have a, was the quote, robust but unofficial relationship. Very robust, but as yet unofficial. So we've talked very briefly about how the political relationship has changed in the last several decades, but the economic relationship between the three countries has also changed quite a bit. Damien, since sort of the normalization of trade relations between the US and China, how has that changed, like very, very broadly?
Well, you're asking me to cover, 40, 50 years of U.S.-China history, and I'll try to do it, pithily in 30 seconds. Essentially, the United States and China found a strategic alignment in the 1970s where both feared the Soviet Union more than each other. And so that drove a strategic alignment there where, Nixon went to China, dealt with Mao Zedong at the time, and that led to 7 years later a formal normalization of relations under President Jimmy Carter. So ever since then, one of the biggest issues that was sort of put aside is precisely what we're talking about, is the Taiwan issue, that there's not going to be a resolution, of course, but it was still important for the two countries to normalize with each other and have diplomatic relationships, even though Taiwan was still sort of, this one issue that's been managed for the last 40 years. And so after the Soviet Union fell, at the end of the 1980s, early 90s, the U.S.-China essentially lost the strategic rationale, right? They no longer had to deal with a common perceived threat, and so the relationship turned predominantly to economic and trade linkages. It's about today, the numbers vary, but it's roughly a $500 billion trading relationship between the two countries. It's one of the most. If you take out Canada, it's typically the number 2 or number 3 trading partner with the United States, depending on the year. Obviously, it's more than just trade. There's a lot of people-to-people connections. There's a lot of U.S. companies investing in China. Obviously, the biggest symbol here is, I'm sure many of you here carry an Apple iPhone. That's perhaps a big symbol of the economic interdependence of the two countries. And that held together until about probably the first Trump administration. And things started to change a lot because I think for a variety of reasons, but I'll just make it very short. One of the big reasons I think the United States is having a second thought about sort of the benefits and costs of globalization and its dependence and exposure to the Chinese economy. We can get more into that. And I think that's led to a much more wholesale re-examination of our economic relationship, which has a lot of security dimensions as well.
It is a complicated set of issues. So we mentioned that Trump administration in the first term brought a lot of changes. Second Trump administration now also bringing more changes. Kharis, if you had to characterize this administration's policy toward Taiwan, how would you characterize it? What is this administration's Taiwan policy?
Well, I think it's undetermined, kind of like Taiwan's status. It's not clear what the Trump administration's Taiwan policy is. I think right now we've got potentially multiple policies that are in some tension or competition with one another right now. So state and DOD are often in tension over how to manage the Taiwan issue in U.S.-China relations. I think DOD right now views Taiwan as, or the threat to Taiwan as the pacing challenge, and they are in many ways consistent with the previous Biden administration's approach to revamping U.S. force posture in the Western Pacific and trying to prepare a better defensive structure to defend Taiwan if it comes to a conflict. The other parts of the administration, though, especially on trade issues, Taiwan got hit with a very large tariff, and the effort to negotiate a kind of bilateral trade deal that was almost complete under the Biden administration has been suspended, given this administration's focus on bilateral trade deficits. And so it's not clear to me whether there's a kind of overall comprehensive approach to Taiwan. I think, in fact, there isn't yet, and it's going to be some time before it's clear where this administration is going to go on Taiwan.
It's more of a department-by-department approach rather than a wholesale theory of the case. Roy, is that also true for U.S.-China relations?
I think it is true for U.S.-China relations. I would encourage everyone to kind of rethink the way that U.S. policy is being made and articulated, and how U.S. power is being exercised in the current moment. I think that we have to look less at country or region-specific formulas that have been a part of our policymaking process for a long time, such as, seeing the defense of Taiwan perhaps as geostrategically important because of its location on China's periphery, close to U.S. allies and partners with whom we have security commitments. And you have to start thinking of it more as a series of priorities where countries don't neatly fit into the prioritization anymore. So when I think about the Trump administration's priorities, I would say that trade imbalances are probably at the top, and tariffs are the tool that the Trump administration is using to exercise U.S. leverage in order to resolve those trade imbalances. Then underneath that is probably domestic issues. So it's immigration and all of the changes that the administration wants to make to judicial systems, et cetera, in order to exercise its power at home. And then maybe third would be kind of regional defense issues. So the U.S. wanting to look at Greenland, relations with Canada, relations with South America. So where does Taiwan fit into all of those things? It's a complicated picture. Taiwan is obviously, as Kharis mentioned, not immune from the trade deficit conversation. I think it's important for everyone to also consider that as the U.S. and China kind of start to try to de-risk or decouple, that cross-Taiwan Strait trade, so trade between China and Taiwan, is still growing at this point, at this moment in time. So even as the political situation gets worse, Taiwan's actually hit in several different ways by the administration's policy. So I think that in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, there's obviously a really strong emphasis from the Trump administration on business opportunities. I think that's why you see some of the fluctuation in these trade talks where, on the one hand, the Trump administration wants to resolve the trade imbalances. On the other hand, it's willing to open up new areas for trade that, other administrations had considered sensitive for national security reasons. And so you really have to think about all of this less as like a policy that is country-specific or target-specific, and instead a competing set of different priorities that sometimes lead to multiple different departmental policies. And with the recent restructuring of the National Security Council, which is an organ inside the U.S. bureaucracy that does a lot of that interagency coordination, I would expect this picture to continue to stay very complicated and somewhat, at times, contradictory.
So we've touched on a lot of things there, including the attempts by Washington and also Beijing to sort of restructure some of their supply chains, partly born out of the post-COVID realizations that the U.S. and China depended on each other for a lot of these critical goods. Damien, how is that attempt playing out at the market level? Is it successful? Is this causing problems for companies in both countries? Like, how is this functioning?
Supply chains are exceptionally complicated and they're exceptionally complex. And 6 or 7 years ago, I don't think anybody really cared about supply chains, but now everybody wants to know where everything comes from, where that widget is made, where it ends up, and and the reason it's complex, it's predominantly driven by companies, multinational corporations. It's not really driven by any government per se. But it so happens that over the last 25 years, 30 years, China has really invested in an extremely formidable manufacturing base. Right now, its manufacturing value added is larger than the United States and the European Union combined. They've really put a lot of effort in what I would call becoming the make everything country. So if Amazon is the everything store, China's the make everything country. And it was, 10 years ago, we used to think China was only going to make, low value goods like, shoes and socks. But in the last 10 years, that attitude has completely changed, where they're now making high value added technology products, some of which are quite critical to the global economy, in particular clean energy products like solar panels, lithium-ion batteries. all the things that it turns out that the U.S. does not have much of. Just give you one quick statistic that always kind of makes my jaw drop. There's really only one solar manufacturer, U.S. solar manufacturer of scale. There's a single one. That's it. Guess how many China has? At least 1,500, right? And so they built that. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, and now 4 out of 5 every solar panel in the world is made in China. So you can go down the list of other product categories, but this has become, and people have started to notice this is now a serious problem, because that means not just the United States, but the European Union and many other countries, if you want to do a clean energy transition, you're essentially going to have to, at least for in the near term, depend a lot on Chinese products. So as a country, and it's not just the United States, people have to decide whether that exposure, that dependence is worthwhile or not. And I think it's the judgment of not just the Trump administration, but also of the previous Biden administration, that this is not an acceptable risk, and that we need to do what we can to avoid these single points of failure. And the same thing on chips too. It's probably not necessarily the best idea to depend on one company to manufacture 75% of the world's most advanced chips. So these issues are now really coming to the fore. They're not going to go away, because this transition will take at least a decade. So so this could be quite disruptive. And the one thing that everyone should worry about from sort of a price standpoint is whether this process will be hugely inflationary if we really sort of reduce dependence really quickly on China and without substitutes. So that's a question that I think we can try to answer down the line.
So one of the Biden administration's solutions to some of these challenges was the idea of friendshoring. That, well, we understand that we have these dependencies. We may not be able to relocate all of them domestically, but we can rely on friends and allies and partners around the world who can make those things domestically and will create sort of trusted supply chains. Is that still going on under this administration? How much of that was reliant on some of these subsidies and agreements with friendly countries that may no longer exist?
Is that a question for me or for
anyone who wants to tackle that? It touches on a lot of your subjects.
So I think there's still an interest in many allied countries to create trusted supply networks to do this friendshoring, but the Donald Trump administration's top priority is manufacturing in the United States, and we have yet to see how friendshoring might be an incentive for countries to manage the trade negotiations that are upcoming with the United States. I mean, my big picture sense on all of this is that we have an administration that's very focused on bilateral trade deficit, but understands it has other priorities. And so one thing I'm watching is how much of these negotiations that are coming up will be actually about the deficit, and how much can countries offer other things to the United States, things under other priorities, in order to satisfy this administration and to lower the tariffs that have been put in place. So friendshoring may become part of a menu of options, but I think, again, if you're looking at it in terms of prioritization, manufacturing in the United States is at the top, and that's a huge challenge for Taiwan. Taiwan is investing an incredible amount of money in building semiconductor fabrication sites, fabs in the United States, prominently in Arizona, a swing state in the U.S. And but it's facing a lot of challenges with the Trump administration's trade policy and actually making that project viable, because as Damien pointed out, these supply chains are really complex, and so. The tariffs that are applied to other countries actually affect what is available in Arizona for this plant. And on top of that, the United States has some things that it needs to work toward on workforce training, talent, resources. We've got a plant that requires an incredible amount of water that we have put in a desert. So these are the types of challenges that Taiwan is now facing, I think, to they've made this big investment. They were hoping it would satisfy the Trump administration on trade. But again, they're being hit from multiple angles here as the Trump administration prioritizes trade deficits and bilateral and bringing manufacturing home rather than options like friendshoring, which might kind of spread the benefits out among multiple countries.
So, Kharis, we've mentioned a couple of times now the sort of lock that Taiwan has on high-end chip manufacturing. And the Taiwanese have started talking about this as the silicone shield, the thing that makes Taiwan critical and essential to the global economy, that in some way might protect Taiwan. How did Taiwan become the hub of chip manufacturing in such a critical area and maintain it in the face of being so close to a country that's very, very good at acquiring other countries' technologies?
Yeah, I've wondered that for a while. I've studied Taiwan for over 20 years, but I didn't actually know what TSMC was until probably less than 10 years ago. It was not a household name in Taiwan. To many of us, it seemed to come out of nowhere and dominate this space. But I do think you actually have to go quite a ways back in time to understand how TSMC came to be such a dominant player in this field. And more generally, I should note, TSMC is kind of the headliner here, but there's a very large ecosystem of companies that support the production of advanced semiconductors in Taiwan. And that ecosystem was built up over 40, 50 years, really. So it's a combination of nurture, culture, and luck. I think. So the nurture part is the Taiwanese government invested in developing semiconductor companies in the 1970s. They had a kind of startup incubator called ITRI that was built in Hsinchu, where TSMC is now headquartered. And ITRI was focused on training engineers, learning the latest procedures for manufacturing. They actually dispatched, in their initial effort, about 40 engineers to the United States to study with RCA. And those 40 engineers mostly came back then and became kind of the core of the nascent semiconductor industry in Taiwan. And then, in addition, Taiwan had this office park or science park model where they would remove a lot of regulatory hurdles to creating companies that were involved in the high-tech industry and exporting abroad or partnering with technology companies. That model still exists today. There's a lot of benefits to locating in these science parks as a company, tax benefits and so forth. The culture part is that Taiwan, for a long time, that the bulk of Taiwan's export-oriented economy was based on contract manufacturing. And so the kind of contract manufacturing that companies, Damien noted Apple today, the kind of contract manufacturing that Taiwan used to do was things like KEDs for Kmart, and they would get an order that would come in and it would be spread along a bunch of basically family-sized, very, very small household firms. But those firms then developed the ability to pivot very, very quickly and to respond to what buyers in the United States wanted. And so that there's actually kind of contract manufacturing culture in Taiwan that I think is a hidden part of their the success of TSMC. So TSMC is very different from Intel in that it doesn't design its own chips. It just manufactures chips that other companies design. And when it was founded in 1987, that was a really radical shift from the model of the industry before then. And that has allowed them over the years to develop without concerns about leaking IP. And Intel has had this problem for a while. So nurture, culture, and then a bit of this is luck as well. TSMC, about 15 years ago, went all in on this kind of cutting edge technology called ultraviolet lithography, extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV, I should say. And Intel had also invested in that technology, but decided in the end that it wouldn't work, and so tried to basically double down on their pre-existing manufacturing processes. And TSMC pushed all their chips into the middle on that issue, and it did, or that technology, and it did work. And so they vaulted ahead in this race. And there's strong path dependence in this race too. So if you are the major producer of cutting edge chips, everybody wants to buy from you. They don't want to buy from the second place. And then you have a lot of capital to reinvest in R&D. And so over the last 10 years, TSMC has just vaulted ahead in this race to the point where Intel now is facing an existential crisis.
I think the really interesting thing when I have heard folks who are sort of from that sector talk about their success was the importance of talent and personnel and the people rather than any one specific patent or one specific piece of technology. But we're also now at a point where the competition for talent between the US and China and Taiwan and Europe, frankly, is getting really intense and kind of complicated. Damien, you've done a lot of work on talent specifically and where the top talent's coming from.
So speaking of chip talent, the Taiwanese chip sector is so formidable that we've even gotten some of their talent. So some of the two biggest chip companies are led by Taiwanese American, Jensen Huang and Lisa Su, NVIDIA and AMD respectively. And TSMC is makes a certain types of chip, but if you're talking about artificial intelligence, which is I think what you're referring to here, that is going to be that is and will continue to be one of the major frontiers for U.S.-China competition, both economically and technologically. And so chips is one big part of artificial intelligence. That's one important ingredient to have a AI industry. Broadly called compute. So you need chips and data centers. So we have the chips, NVIDIA, mostly, and we're building the data centers. And the second piece is you need a lot of data. Because the AI models has to train on the world's data essentially. So more data, the better. The more input, and the models get smarter. And then the last piece is the talent piece. You need to have really smart PhDs, AI scientists, researchers to really advance the models and train them and really develop the frontier models. And here is where we really lag China. China now has roughly half of the world's top AI talent, meaning top 20%, roughly the top 20% of artificial intelligence researchers and scientists are coming out of China. Many of them also work for big companies in the United States, but a lot of them are now, choosing to stay in China because China has a lot of opportunities in artificial intelligence. They've had a lot of companies that are now also investing heavily in AI. So on the talent race, at least right now, we are if we don't, get foreign talent, we will have a scarcity of AI talent in this country. And just to get, to kind of reinforce the point about how competitive this area is, I've seen some folks in the tech industry have said basically everyone's fighting over about 1,000 or 2,000 people, right? That's sort of the universe of top talent in the world that are, the smartest people, the best of the best that can actually advance AI models. So you're not looking at a huge pool of talent. And many of them are going to be Chinese. Many of them, from some other countries. But I think it's the reality right now is that we are currently losing out on the talent war, or the talent competition rather.
I think this is where, Roy, your point earlier about prioritization and priorities rather than policies comes back into play, because the administration's immigration priorities are definitely conflicting with maybe their priorities on acquiring top talent.
Accurate.
So,
Correct.
It seems like sort of Chinese students in the U.S. and also U.S. students in China, to a certain extent, are getting caught in some of this crossfire between these two countries.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And it's not just students. It's also people who are working here in businesses on visas. And I think this is it's an unfortunate outgrowth of strategic and economic competition that people-to-people exchange has been, from my perspective, over-securitized. So, for example, if the Trump administration has said that it wants to make sure to investigate Chinese citizen talent at universities to make sure that they're not working for the Communist Party, et cetera. But when you look at the actual cases that have been brought on espionage against Chinese nationals working at U.S. universities, it's a pretty small number compared to the overall number of Chinese people living, working, and studying here in the United States. But it goes back to, I think, a core point, and this is more on U.S.-China than Taiwan. I think we have a lack of understanding in the United States of how the Communist Party interacts and incentivizes its own citizens. So, and that's almost deliberate. The system of control that China has over its own people is deliberately opaque. It's deliberately unclear because that helps the Chinese government encourage a lot of self-censorship, which is efficient for their system of authoritarian control. But the kind of like unfortunate sub piece of that is that if we don't have clarity on how the Chinese government interacts, directs, controls, like take your verb, its own citizens, especially even if they're in the United States, then we really can't develop a useful policy to maximize the benefits of all of this talent while minimizing perhaps some of the risks. So I think that, a little bit of clarity from Beijing on exactly, kind of how it wants its citizens to act abroad, and a clarity on the level of control it actually has to compel those actions would go a long way towards right-sizing this issue of whether or not the U.S. and China can have people-to-people exchange. And ditto on the Chinese side, U.S. students are often seen as people who are like spreading ideas, democracy, et cetera. I've met a lot of U.S. students. They're wonderful. I don't know that spreading democracy in China is top on their list of priorities. They want to hang out, they want to have fun, they want to experience different cultures, et cetera. But it's that the sensitivity in China about the ideas space is so tight right now that U.S. students are looking at it and saying, do I want to live under this tight political environment? I could go anywhere in the world. Maybe I'll take myself elsewhere. And as the U.S. and China economic competition heats up, I think there used to be, perhaps when I was a student and in my early career, a sense that going to China was a very good career move. And now it seems increasingly like the opposite. It's actually a liability because you will come home and you will be labeled as somebody who's sympathetic to the mission, objectives, and priorities of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think all of those things together are like big overall picture where we are on people-to-people exchange. But it's unfortunate because it's probably not fit for purpose in the times that we actually live in, where our economies are very interdependent. And we have a lot we could do together if we could manage the irritants in the bilateral relationship.
Sort of one of the places where students seem to be moving, though, if they're moving out of China and they still want to do Chinese language studies, is into Taiwan. And Taiwan's sort of trying to pick up some of those students, but also news organizations and media outlets that have been forced to leave Beijing and relocated across the strait. How's that working out for Taiwan?
Well, I think Taiwan is really benefiting from the kind of the closing down of what used to be semi-open spaces in China. As you noted, there's a significant number of reporters who've relocated across the strait. And I should note also the crackdown in Hong Kong has accelerated that trend as well. Hong Kong is no longer a protected space to do reporting on mainland China anymore. And so a significant number of reporters who were based there have also relocated to Taiwan. A few also in Tokyo or Seoul or Singapore. But Taiwan has rolled out the red carpet. They're happy to have them there. And it's almost, from the Taiwanese perspective, this is almost a return to the way things were during the Cold War, when the PRC was the enemy and Taiwan was part of the free world and free China. And if you wanted to learn Chinese, you went to Taiwan, not to the mainland, because it was closed off. And so I have very mixed feelings about that trend, but I certainly see it in my own classes at Stanford. The enrollments in Taiwan politics have shot up, and interest in going to Taiwan rather than the PRC has also, it's dramatically shifted in the Taiwan direction.
Damien, have you seen that with any of the students you interact with, interest in moving away from going to China somewhere else?
Oh, no. I mean, I think, well, there's definitely general cooling, but also I think, with COVID and pandemic, there's just been the practical difficulties and challenges of getting to China or to the United States have become more cumbersome. And I think even for folks like us, it's a little more, it's more difficult than it used to be. So that's just a disincentive for a lot of people. And so, I'm seeing a lot more, Zoom meetings for better or worse, rather than physically going there, which I don't think that's necessarily good development. I think you do need to have boots on the ground. If not, live there, but certainly go there regularly. And that goes not just for China, but for any sort of area, region that you want to be studying. I think having that experiential, learning opportunity is quite important.
It's also important across the strait, right? So some of these trends that we're talking about in U.S. and China have also happened between Taiwan and mainland China or China. So there's less academic exchange. I mean, a lot less academic exchange. There's no opportunity for even unofficial dialogue between the governing, officials on both sides of the strait. And in that type of separation, there's fewer tourists as well going back and forth, and a lot more security concerns for Taiwan business people and citizens that want to live, work, or study in the mainland. And so in that type of separation, you do increase the risk of not being able to see the full picture of what the other side is thinking and doing. And so the misperceptions and miscommunications that can arise from that type of letting off the people-to-people exchange can actually reverberate out through security policy and in ways that raise the risk of tensions.
I'm actually sort of amazed we've gotten this far into the conversation without getting directly to security things, because usually that's the first thing that everyone talks about. Obviously, there's big debates in the U.S. Government and U.S. policy circles about how the U.S. should prepare Taiwan, help Taiwan, what kind of aid the U.S. should provide to Taiwan. But Kharis, how are those debates playing out in Taiwan? I mean, these are the people for whom it really deeply matters.
Yeah, so the effort to get Taiwan to increase its defense spending, this is a very salient issue in Taiwan right now, in part because there are very prominent members of the current administration in the U.S. pushing Taiwan to raise its defense budgets, to revamp its training. All of those things have happened over the last 5 years, but not at the pace that a lot of people in this administration would like to see. Maybe the best way to answer this question is to refer to some public opinion data that I just saw that unfortunately was not by the Chicago Council, but your equivalent in Taiwan actually did a survey. Well, I'll note two. One is by INDSR, which actually found that trust in the United States to come to Taiwan's defense actually increased support for Taiwan to raise defense spending. So they were positively correlated. And so there is actually a kind of defeatist element in Taiwan that says the U.S. isn't going to come save us. We can't fight the PRC alone, so why should we spend anything on defense? And so what that survey suggested then is if the U.S. makes a clearer commitment to defend Taiwan, even if it's conditional, you could help public opinion push, or you would improve public opinion in a way that supports defense spending. The other survey I'll note is about the Trump administration's impact on belief in the U.S. Security umbrella. And the Trump tariffs in particular, I know this is not directly a security issue, but the imposition of a 32% tariff on Taiwan on the so-called Liberation Day actually produced a pretty dramatic negative swing in Taiwan and dramatically undercut faith that the United States would come to defend Taiwan if it came to it. And so while it's tempting to try to separate these issues out, in Taiwan, security and economics have always been linked. They're linked in their cross-strait approach. They're linked in their ties to the U.S. And so what the current administration in the U.S. does in one space is going to affect attitudes in other spaces as well.
I'm glad you mentioned INDSR. We had the chance to do some joint research with them last year. We're doing it again this year. I think I have some copies of reports on bet tables in the back, but it's also available on our website.
Fantastic.
I do want to remind everyone, we're getting close to Q&A time. Remember, you can put your questions in at ccga.live, or when the microphone comes out, you can queue up for the microphone. So we talked a lot about sort of cross-strait tensions. How do Washington and Taipei and Beijing find the right balance between deterrence and reassurance?
Yeah, so I think it might be useful for this audience to kind of understand what the U.S. defense commitment to Taiwan is, which is basically when Washington switched recognition of the ruler of China from Taipei to Beijing in the 1970s. Concurrently, the U.S. Congress passed something called the Taiwan Relations Act, which obligates the United States to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive nature. What we're in right now in kind of cross-Taiwan Strait relations and with the U.S. having that commitment is what I would call a security dilemma. It's a complicated political science concept to basically say that all three of these actors believe that they are acting in defense, but the way that they are defending themselves is being seen by the other side as aggressive or escalatory. So when Beijing does a military exercise around Taiwan, of course, the United States and Taiwan see that as aggressive and escalatory. But from Beijing's perspective, they are trying to deter, to prevent Taiwan from making the choice to declare independence. Unfortunately, that means that the U.S. and Taiwan react, right? We react and to defend Taiwan and to defend the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. And Beijing views that as escalatory and aggressive. So we're in this kind of downward spiral where neither side is viewing the other side's interests in defense as legitimate. So the balance between reassurance and deterrence, I think, is a great question. Because from my perspective, deterrence as a strategy, when you're trying to get someone not to do something, you don't just create an aggressive military signal. You also reassure your adversary that if they choose the course that you prefer, that you won't further escalate the situation. You won't go any farther to kind of compromise their own interests. And so I think the balance is less between deterrence and reassurance, and it's how do you restore the reassurance part of deterrence? How does Beijing, conduct a military exercise, but also say exactly why they did it and what behavior it is that they're trying to address through that signaling? It would obviously be much easier and more reassuring for everyone if the two sides of the strait could just talk to each other, because in dialogue you can provide a lot of those reassurances that feel very hollow, otherwise. But I think that's the balance that everyone is trying to strike, because in reality, nobody wants to go to war in the Taiwan Strait. It would be absolutely devastating for the global economy. We haven't mentioned, but upwards of 80% of the world's shipping transits in and around Taiwan. So you won't have an iPhone anymore if we go to war in the Taiwan Strait. We're also talking about, if it's something that the U.S. feels compelled to respond to, war between two nuclear powers with advanced militaries. So when you talk to U.S. military planners about this, they say this goes what they call multi-domain fast, which means that is a space war, it's an air war, it's a land war, it's a sea war. It's got cyber, it's got nuclear escalation. I mean, the scope of conflict over Taiwan could be massive, and the effects would be immediately devastating. So I think that when we look at the security dynamics, we have to spend a little bit more time thinking about how each side can reassure each other that at least hears the other side's interest, even if it doesn't agree. And in fact, that was the agreement that brought the U.S. and China together in the early 1970s. The U.S. agreed to acknowledge China's position that China and Taiwan belong to one country without actually agreeing to it. So coming back to some creative diplomacy, while it may seem very far away in the current political climate and all on both sides, would be the way to restore, deterrence, reassurance balance.
All right, I do want to claim, we do have a lot of people queued up. Kharis, we were talking right before we came out here about things that you're looking for in the next 6 months. And you mentioned something about Taiwanese domestic politics that was really interesting.
Yeah,
tell the audience that?
We haven't talked about that at all tonight, but there's actually divided government in Taiwan right now. So the president is from the DPP, that's the ruling party. He does not have a majority of his own party in the legislature. It's controlled by an opposition coalition. And the opposition has blocked a lot of things that he's wanted to do, including some spending on the defense, on the military. And so there is actually now a recall effort afoot to recall a bunch of those opposition legislators. And it's plausible, I don't think it's particularly likely, but it's plausible that that effort could succeed in recalling enough legislators and flipping seats that President Lai could end up with a majority of his own party in the next 6 months. That would have, I think, a pretty big impact both on Taiwan domestic politics. Obviously, he can do, as the leader of the DPP, he can push through a lot more in the legislature. But I'm also, and this is less obvious, a little bit worried about what that might mean for Beijing and their response. Right now, Beijing is reassured by the fact that the most kind of China skeptical party in Taiwan is blocked in the legislature, and the parties there that hold a majority are more China friendly. If they lose their majority and it flips to the DPP, Beijing may react to that in ways that are quite dramatic and potentially cause a new crisis.
Fun times. All right, we'll start with questions here in the room from the audience. Please introduce yourself very briefly and just make sure that your question is indeed a question and not a comment.
I'm Eric Mao. I run the Geopolitical Forum. I'm born and raised in Taiwan, by the way. You mentioned the China side. Well, I get to a question like in 10 seconds. Like, is China is ambiguous, like they're not making clear their intention in terms of their military exercise. I think Chinese government's going to distance to make it clear their intention, including their military intention. Of course, they're not going to get into specific tactics because that's what military is about. So about ambiguity, I think ambiguity, that's my question. It's on the side of the US. We all know the term, or most of us probably know, strategic ambiguity. So that's been going on since probably the Taiwan Relations Act. That's the US attitude. So what do you think US gain? Because that's US policy, they must be gaining something from it. So what do you think it's a gain? And what is it that US, that's an opportunity cost or cost of any kind to the US? And what do you think in terms of tipping point? What do you think that strategic ambiguity, the trend, is it going to go more ambiguous or less ambiguous? Thanks.
Okay, those are big questions. So strategic ambiguity refers to the fact that U.S. policy on Taiwan's sovereignty is that we don't take a position on the resolution of the sovereignty issue. We can't say, should Taiwan be independent? Should it be reunified with the mainland? We agree to an ambiguous position and say that we do not want this issue resolved through the use of force or coercion. That is our Taiwan policy. We don't take a position on the eventual sovereignty of Taiwan, but we don't want to see it resolved through force or coercion. And I think what that's given the U.S. is a variety of policy options. It's given us flexibility at times to even have U.S. officials informally tell Taiwan, hey, you're skirting a little too close to the line here, and we really want this issue to be resolved without the use of force or coercion, including force or coercion that might be sparked by Taiwan's own actions. So I think that is what it's given us. It's actually from my perspective, it's an excellent policy because it focuses on the tactics and gives us policy options. Taking a position on Taiwan's sovereignty would put us on one side or the other in a way that would probably be more risky to our own interests in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So I think strategic ambiguity has kept the peace. It's my opinion. You do not have to agree with it. Where is it headed? I think it's increasingly difficult to maintain strategic ambiguity because the balance of military power across the strait has become so skewed in China's favor that the use of force or coercion has basically been baked into the Taiwan equation now. So there's a lot of pressure in the United States to say one way or the other if the U.S. would defend Taiwan under any circumstances, and I think that pressure will continue to build. But is that ultimately good for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait? My sense is still that if we can maintain the space for strategic ambiguity, a lot of things are possible. Under strategic ambiguity, the two sides of the strait actually did come together, create economic agreements, promote cross-strait trade and investment, and calm a series of tensions. So that's my opinion. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take one question from online, and then we'll go back to the in-room. A year ago, I think we would have had a lot more discussion here about TikTok and social media. American government officials have said that TikTok is a major security threat, yet it has not been banned, and a number of American political leaders have TikTok accounts. Is this something you're worried about?
Not particularly.
Okay.
I mean, Taiwan hasn't banned TikTok. Taiwan also has Xiaohongshu, Little Red Book, or Notebook, Red Book, I think is the English translation. And Taiwan is much more susceptible to PRC influence in their politics than I think we are. And Taiwan also has, Freedom House ranks Taiwan as a much better democracy than ours today. And so I guess my prior here is I'm skeptical that TikTok is the root source of all of our problems in the US. And I mean, if somebody makes a compelling case that it is it is extracting a huge amount of data, personal data about Americans, that's potentially a reason to at least put some limits on what it's capable of doing. But so do a lot of our own tech companies. So I think the conversation over TikTok should probably take place in a much larger conversation about data privacy, what social media companies are obligated to protect in terms of your privacy, and also digital sovereignty. And like our companies, if they're collecting our data, should they actually have an office physically in the country that we're in? And these are questions that affect all democracies, not just ours.
Hello, my name is Carson Keller. I'm a student with Missouri State University. My question is directed to Mr. Templeman, but anyone can answer. I'm going to provide a little bit of brief context and then get to my questions. So within the last few years, a lot of American arms shipments to Taiwan have been kind of very slow in getting there. I'm referring to like the 100+ Abrams, the HIMARS batteries, and Harpoon launchers that we've been sending over. And while those have recently gotten there, there's also been the case where earlier this year, a number of E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft got refused for sale to Taiwan alongside some anti-submarine helicopters. So with this kind of delayed arms shipments and then outright refused arms shipment to Taiwan, would you think that this is a shift in the Trump administration regarding perhaps placating the mainland by putting a limit on the capabilities of the ROC armed forces?
That's a good question. Should I take this one? So there's a headline number about the backlog in U.S. arms sales to Taiwan that's something on the order of $23 billion. The problem with that headline number is that backlog is just everything that's been announced but hasn't yet been delivered. And if you know anything about military contracting, once you sign a contract, there's a certain amount of time that elapses before the contract is, or before the partner producing the weapons is in breach of the contract. And so that $23 billion does not include, most of it is not stuff that is in breach of the contract, right? I think it's the majority of it is not in breach. I should note that first. So delivery for some items has been slower than the contract specified, but a lot of those are just items that have been announced. The Taiwanese have paid for it. The contract says it needs to be delivered by this date. That date is still in the future, and it gets lumped into the sum total of things that haven't been delivered yet. So that's the first thing. And then on the second, I actually don't think the Trump administration has signaled that they are trying to placate Beijing by slowing down arms sales. There was an interview with a couple anonymous sources in the Trump administration a couple weeks ago where they flat out said, our goal is to sell more in at least number value terms to Taiwan in the second Trump administration than we did in the first Trump administration. And I think to come back to a point we started with, I think there are multiple Taiwan policies in this administration right now. And I think the NSC and the DoD are fully supportive of accelerating arms sales and increasing the quality and quantity of materials sold to Taiwan. Other parts of the administration may not be.
Hello, my name is Yogesh Sawant. I was born and raised in the United States, and typically I consider myself to be more interested in technology than I am in geopolitics, but as we've seen in this discussion, the two are now inseparable. I'm alluding to the discussion about the competition for compute and talent in the race for artificial intelligence, which many people have compared to something like the Manhattan Project and the arms race in building this technology. And I think that a lot of people view artificial intelligence as it's become a buzzword referring only to things like ChatGPT, but I believe that there are much more dangerous capabilities for narrow applications of machine learning, such as cybersecurity, biological warfare, things like that. My question is, what's the impact of the general attitude towards artificial intelligence, and how does that affect the general consensus on the Taiwan issue of the United States defending Taiwan from China? And how much further does this technology have to develop before people will realize that we're facing an extinction level event with this technology, and this is a battle that we cannot afford to lose?
Damien, you want to talk sort of briefly about how maybe China internally sees AI development?
So I would say that what you portray is sort of a dystopian view of sort of, the machines will take over artificial general intelligence. I would say there's even a big debate here in the United States about whether we will actually achieve AGI anytime soon. There's a lot of skeptics on that front. And I think China in general does not hold these dystopian views, probably because they don't have quite the same sci-fi movies that we've had in the 2000s. There's no Minority Report. No, I'm joking, but I'm not even joking. They don't have the same. I think a lot of our dystopian view comes from Black Mirror shows like that, right? China just doesn't have those things, and a lot of their AI is much more for industrial applications right now. And so they're going to have factory robots and those kinds of things to make sort of production more efficient. That's where a lot of their use cases are going right now. So I think they're at the same place as anyone else on whether AGI will become the all-encompassing technology. And I think to your question, I mean, you can define artificial intelligence like the Manhattan Project or a nuclear bomb, or you can define it as a general purpose technology like electricity. That definition matters a lot. And I don't think we have settled on if it's electricity, it's everywhere. There's no problems with people having electricity, right? If it's a nuclear weapon, okay, that's something different. So I would say we have not settled that question at all. And I think even the smartest AI scientists will dispute whether AGI is reachable, attainable in the next 5 to 10 years.
Rorry, you had a two-finger on this?
In 30 seconds, I think the real dystopian effect of AI will be what happens when it comes for the workforce around the world and what kind of political and social change that will drive and develop long before we get to the point where AGI is controlling humans like robots. We're going to have to deal with the social and political change of workforce adaptation. And I think that will be coming in the next 5 to 6 years, whereas AGI might not. With a nuclear bomb, you can only build a nuclear bomb. That's it. You can't build a good enough nuclear bomb to do things with. But AI doesn't need to be the most advanced model ever to displace a lot of the global workforce. And I would pay attention to that in your dystopian future.
All right, we'll take one more from the audience, if you could make it in about 30 seconds, because I am already over time.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a Chicago resident. My question is, beyond the immediate conflict that would result, what does Washington think would happen to U.S. interests and security guarantees around the globe if we chose not to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion?
You want me to give
It's a small question, Kharis.
I mean, I can give the litany of potential consequences. One, Taiwan exists as a de facto, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, de facto independent state today because the US intervened in June 1950 to prevent a PLA invasion across the Taiwan Strait. And we inserted ourselves into the middle of the Chinese Civil War, and we've been there ever since. So we have a 75-year security partnership with Taiwan. If we were to walk away from that partnership, the reputational consequences, I think, would be orders of magnitude larger than anything the US would do with Afghanistan or Ukraine. Credibility, reputational consequences are a big potential fallout from this. Taiwan is the US's 9th or 8th largest trading partner right now. And if the PRC invaded Taiwan, they're potentially in a position to completely sever that trading link, as well as the link with the US and the PRC. That would have huge economic consequences for the world and would be particularly bad for the United States. Then there's concerns about if the US tried to reinforce our defensive position in the Western Pacific with other partners and allies. So Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines are all treaty allies. It becomes much more difficult to defend them against a concerted PRC effort. And all three of those, I should note, have territorial disputes with the PRC. It becomes harder for the US, in fact, almost impossible in some cases to execute a successful defense of those partners and allies. And so there are more, but I'll stop there.
It is complicated. That is unfortunately all the time we have for tonight. I've already run several minutes over. My apologies for keeping you. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I look forward to seeing you again in the future. If this is a subject you're interested in, we have ongoing research on East Asia and the Indo-Pacific from the Lester Crown Center, both public opinion and policy work. Stay tuned, subscribe to our newsletters, and I'll see you at an event again soon. Good night.